everybody, and welcome back to the workshop. In today's episode, I'm going to be starting on my Journeyman knife building series. Before we do that, let's give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, which is AG1 by Athletic Greens. We'll talk more about them later on. So you're probably wondering, Will, what is a journeyman knife build? Most of us are probably familiar with the term journeyman. Historically, it would be someone who was no longer an apprentice. They had achieved a level of proficiency, but they weren't quite a master yet. They wouldn't have their own shops usually. They'd be working underneath a master, but they weren't a total newbie. And that's kind of the same way how it is in the American Bladesmith Society. There's 3 ratings. When you join, you get the rating of apprentice smith, and then after 3 years, you're able to test under a panel of master smiths for your journeyman rating. That's a 2-part test. You do a performance test, and you guys have probably seen I did my video on that earlier, wherein you take the knife through a series of cutting tests and whatnot, and then after you pass that, then you make 5 knives to submit to a panel of judges at a show. Blade Show is the big one that people do it at, but I think there's a couple other shows throughout the year that you're able to test at. And so these 5 knives have to be just immaculate. Wonderful fit and finish, good design, good flow, materials choice, construction, all has to be correct. So to start off with the first of my 5 knife set, I'm going to be doing a giant Bowie knife. My sketch is a 10-inch long blade. It might be a little bit longer than that in reality, with a bronze D guard and an African blackwood grip. I'm going to be using 1085 high carbon steel round stock from Pop's Knife Supply for all of my knives, and there's a couple reasons for that, but let's light the forge before we talk about why. Well, here's the deal. You can't use Damascus for your Journeyman set. It needs to be mono steel. And I think part of the big reason for that is that you can actually hide a good bit with Damascus. You can etch away a mediocre hand-sanded finish. You can hide other stuff. It just makes it harder to look at transitions and stuff like that. And so being tasked to use just plain Jane high carbon steel, it just can make it more challenging, and there's less places to hide stuff if you're not doing Damascus. The reason why I'm using this 1-inch round 1085 is because this stuff is really nice to forge. It's very easy to work under the hammer, and then the grinding and finishing process for it is quite nice as well. I haven't noticed too much heat warping, which is a thing that can happen when you're grinding on this stuff in particular. The heat treat for it is nice and simple. It's just a good straightforward steel for me to use on a knife like this. The design that I have planned for this is a 10-inch blade D-guard Bowie. Bowie? It's none of those. The plan is obviously that 1085 for the blade. I'm planning on forging out bronze for the D-guard and then a nice African blackwood handle for the actual grip itself. I'm planning on doing double curved fit-ups from the guard into the handle, which is going to be very challenging to do on both sides. One side really isn't too big of an issue for me, but having to do that on both sides is going to be interesting. This thing will also be a takedown, so there'll be a round nut that'll thread in from the back and hold the whole thing together. Now that we've got our plan laid out, let's go ahead and throw this sucker in the old heat box and heat it up. I was very excited when Athletic Greens reached out to me because I've had it before and because my parents have been drinking AG1 for a long time. They're both very healthy people, and I know that they've really been enjoying it because they've been continuing to use it for quite some time now. I myself got in the habit of drinking it about a month ago, and it's been pretty awesome. It's a great morning ritual and an awesome way to consolidate a ton of supplements and vitamins and other great things for you. It supports your immunity, it supports healthy aging, and the one that I'm most excited about is the energy aspect of it. All of the good stuff in there, the vitamins, the minerals, the probiotics, and the healing mushrooms are just wonderful for you. I've actually been able to cut back on my coffee intake a little bit since I started drinking AG1. I used to be a 4, 5, 6 cup a day kind of guy, but now I've cut back to 1 to 2 cups. I'll have AG1 in the morning, first thing. After that, a cup of coffee while I'm reading my Bible, and then I'll get ready and maybe have another cup of coffee if I'm feeling it on my way down to the shop, which is way better for you than 6. So I really like how it tastes as well. It's got kind of a fruity, almost maybe coconutty flavor to it, kind of coconut watery, but a little bit different. So if you're interested in having some nice, simple, easy to use supplements with all kinds of benefits, go to athleticgreens.com/Will Stelter and you can get started with a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packets. That's the same powder that's in here. So huge thank you to Athletic Greens for sponsoring today's episode. I like you guys a lot. With that, let's jump back on into the old knife making. So it's the next morning now, and I had a little bit of time to think about what I wanted to do to this knife. I'm not done forging it. Where we currently sit is that the cutting edge of the knife is 12 inches long. That's pretty long. In my drawing, it's only 10 inches long. Part of the reason for that is that I kind of ran out of paper. I wanted it to be a little bit longer. Part of the inspiration for this D-guard style Bowie is the Civil War style fighting knife that they carried. I've seen a lot of historical examples of the old, tin photograph, tinning, I don't know what it's called, but the old tin photographs of Civil War soldiers and right around that time period holding a knife that is seriously big enough to be a small sword, kind of like this guy. What I've got to do to this thing right now is, as it currently sits, the thickness of it is right around 315 thousandths of an inch thick. That's about 1/3 of an inch. And the ricasso is only about 960 thousandths wide, so 0.96 inches. Ideally, I want that ricasso to be a little bit wider, a little bit over 1 inch wide when I'm finally done with it, which means that I need to have a little bit of room to grind in here and clean that up. And so I need it to be at about 1.1 inches. Fortunately, I've got my awesome coal iron press. I can throw that aggressive fullering die that I've got in there and kind of squish it out straight sideways down to about 300 thou, and I think that'll give me the width that I'm looking for. I'll do that along the width of the spine as well, and that will give me a little bit more width to the whole blade, which I think will look nice considering how long this thing is. I want it to be a little bit wider. It'll have a nice distal taper down the whole blade. It'll be 300 thou there, or I guess probably about 280 when I'm finally done with it, and it'll be at about probably 200 thou right in here. And so I'll grind that thing nice and thin, and it'll be a Civil War fighter. Whoosh. All right, I got the knife roughly profiled. Time to bring it up to 1500 degrees and quench it in some Parks 50. All right, it's been soaking at 1500 degrees for 5 minutes now. Well, 5 minutes and 30 seconds. Time to quench it. The knife has been heat treated and tempered at 400 degrees twice. That means that it is now in its kind of final heat treating stage. It's going to be super, super tough. I wanted to talk about the things that I want to adjust on my design and on the shape of the blade before moving on. First things first, the cutting edge is now 12 inches long as opposed to 10 inches. So it's a full 2 inches longer. Now, a very nice visual proportion for especially a long knife like this is a 2/3 to 1/3 blade to handle ratio. I'll be able to make that 6 inches from right there to right there, and that I think is just about the right length proportionally to make sure that it flows well and it's not super off balance when you look at it. And then before I do any more grinding on this blade, I need to make up a platen system for my grinder. So basically what I'll do is build a platen system that hooks into my grinder, that the belt will run off and then come back like that, and then I'll be able to take the knife and run it in like this, and that radius right there will cut in my plunge line on the knife right there. And if I have a file guide on there, then it'll be the exact same on both sides. Now I think I'll be able to use a piece of angle iron for this. I'll rip it down to 2 inches wide, clean it up on the mill, flatten down the face that the belt is gonna run on the mill, drill a 3/4 inch hole, cut a nice piece of 3/4 inch round stock that'll fit into the tooling arm of my grinder, radius off my end, and we'll be ready to rock and roll. All right, with the waterfall platen complete, I'm gonna start grinding on this blade. First, cleaning up my flats here, and then kind of working in and starting on my bevels. I won't get too close to my plunge line area because I want to cut all of that in on the waterfall platen. Something else that I noticed is that the edge of the knife itself kind of did a little bit of a bow, which isn't a big deal because I've got a lot of distal taper that I need to grind in, and that gives me a lot of freedom to get that thing completely straightened out while I'm grinding. I started off grinding with a 36 VSM belt before moving on to a nice 60 grit. I want to get my bevels established and at least up to about 120 before I grind in my false edge on the back. All right, I've got the blade pretty rough ground here. It's at 120 grit, and I've got it covered in a nice layer of blue layout fluid. My next step is going to be cutting in the shoulders to my tang, and the reason why I do that before grinding in the plunge lines on the bevel is because I want the plunge lines of the bevel to be square to the tang, and it'll be a little bit easier to do it the other way around. Tang first, then plunge lines. So I'm gonna do a little bit of layout. I'll use a square, get things squared up on there, cut in my shoulders for the tang, and then move on to using my nice new waterfall platen to cut in the actual plunge line itself. I have no idea how that's gonna go. I really hope I don't ruin this blade this far into it by using an unknown. I'll be fine. The main bevels and the plunge lines ground in, it's time to move on to cutting in the false edge, the swedge, the clip, however you want to call it, the sharp pointy bit on the back of the knife. To do that at an angle on a radius platen for something this wide, it gives me a good bit of control over the process and is a nice and fast way to do it. With that false edge ground in, it's time for the super duper mega fun process of hand sanding, bringing this up to a rough 400 grit. I'll be cleaning up the main bevels, the false edge, the spine, the ricasso, and the choil area. Essentially any part of the knife that won't be inside the handle is going to get hand sanded to a rough 400 right now before I move on to forging the bronze guard. Well, this thing came out looking just super duper. There was a lot of very minute 400 grit adjustments, moving things over a couple thousandths of an inch at a time. The next step is going to be moving on to the bronze guard, forging it down from a piece of bar stock in order to have a thin area for the D guard and some nice thick lumps for the top and bottom. I'll measure with a wire off of my drawing and then flatten it out with some marks, figure out exactly where my bends need to be and then how long of an area I need to forge down thin leaving a nice bit of mass on either side for the top and bottom of the guard. This is 954 aluminum bronze. It's very forgeable, very wear resistant, very nice colored bronze, but it's a little bit harder on the cutting tools. Files and mill cutters don't love it so much, but the look and the performance are worth it. All right, so I thought about it while I was grinding on this, and I do now again think that the first thing that I need to do is to cut the guard slot and get it fit to my blade. It'll determine the shape of where the guard flows into the handle, which then determines the distance to the first bend, the second bend, and the third bend, and ultimately where the hole is drilled and how this fits up to the back side of the handles. Well, I've got the guard rough fit now. I've got a little bit of an issue, and that is that the guard can move up and down this direction just like 2 or 3 thousandths of an inch. It's practically nothing, but it's enough that there's a little bit of a line there, and I don't like that. I'm going to be able to fix that by finishing out the rest of the guard and then fitting my handle block onto the tang. And once I have that handle block fit, it'll be secured to the guard, and that will be the last little bit of support that I need so that it can't move back and forth at all. Once that's fit, I'll be able to get that perfect fit on the top of the guard. So we were really close to being able to fit up that block of African blackwood for the handle. I got my little S bend done up in my guard. I need to shape the end of the guard. I'm not going to leave it square. I want it to have a nice, you know what I mean. But when I was bending it, it looks like I dinged this side of the guard. So I'm going to go back with 400 grit on that 6-inch contact wheel and just bump it. So taking off a little bit more material there isn't going to hurt us at all. And then after that's done, I finally get to move on to fitting up the actual handle block. It may not seem like it, but I actually sanded on this thing for about 6 hours today. It was probably about 15 seconds for you guys. It was a lot longer for me, but finally, my facets side to side are crispy and uniform. I've got my upswept thing. It's time to fit the African blackwood block onto the bottom side of the handle. I'll start by drilling a hole on the milling machine all the way through the block before moving to the bench vise to get that thing fit up onto the tang. Once it gets close to touching the guard, I'll remove the top part of that handle material and start to get it fit up to my bronze guard. Well, after roughly 4 hours of working on this handle, I'm getting pretty close. I was getting pretty close. I was sneaking up on it, and in order to check my fit, I'll normally tap the block on and then just hit it lightly with the back of my hand and just seat it a little bit. Well, in this case, I guess the taper was such, and maybe there was a pre-existing crack in the grain or something like that that was just invisible, but this sucker split wide open. Both sides. So I'm going to grab another block of African blackwood and get it fit up. It's now time to head on into the grinding room and to get the top of this blackwood shaped down so that it fits very close to that bronze. So now that I've got the top of the guard fit up, it is looking just swell. I am stoked. It's time to forge out a little bit of bronze that will make up the nut that'll secure this whole handle to the blade. I'm going to make the nut. Then I'm going to braze or weld on a little bit of all thread to the end of my tang, and that's what that nut will thread into. But first things first, forging down the bronze into some 1/2-inch round stock, and from there I'll throw it in the lathe and get it rounded up. Well, most of you guys probably recognize this lathe and this shop. I'm here at Alex Steele's shop. He was kind enough to let me use his lathe to turn down this bronze nut. It's been a minute, but I think I still remember how to run this bad boy. Let's turn it down. I'm going to turn down the main diameter of it to about 3/8 of an inch, which is 0.387 for those of you who use metric. So I'll start off by facing it off on both sides, truing up the majority of it. This is longer than I need it to be, thankfully. And then I'm going to kind of leave one side of it kind of rough. I'll just get it kind of rounded out to the approximate dimensions that I want it to be, and then I'll do a lot of the handwork at my own shop with hand files. So the main things that I need to do on the lathe is I want to get it trued up, and I want to drill a hole and tap down that, and then I'll cut that to length later on when I'm ready. Alrighty, with my bronze pommel nut turned up, you heard me right, it's time to thread this piece of 1/4-inch rod with fine thread, which is 1/4 by 28 threading, and then I think I'm going to try brazing. I've never brazed anything before, but I think I'm going to try brazing the rod onto the end there. So in order to thread this rod, I'll throw the die, which is a male threading tool, into the lathe, and I will put this rod into the Jacobs chuck in the tailstock of my lathe, and I'm able to hand thread it that way and get really, really nice, clean threads that I know are cut square. After that, I'll prepare the end of my tang for the brazing, and then after watching a quick YouTube video, we'll get to brazing using the torch and some 1/8 inch bronze brazing rod. It's covered in flux, which helps that bronze flow better and keeps the area from oxidizing quite as much as far as I understand it. So with the threading done, we'll move on to working onto the back or the bottom side of the bronze D-guard. So we'll drill all the way through with the 11/32 inch bit. We'll drill a pocket which has the correct outside dimension using the 15/32 drill bit, and then get a nice flat spot at the bottom of it using the 7/16 inch end mill. After that's done, we should theoretically be able to hold this knife together. Of course, the guard isn't bent yet, but it means we'll be able to secure the back side of the bronze guard using the pommel nut to the tang, which is a good step forward, because after that, it's time to fit up the back of the guard. I'm gonna be doing the same process where I get it real close and then I do an indentation of the bronze guard into the African blackwood. This should go a little bit quicker this time because we have a lot of I messed things up. So, the way that I wanted this butt cap to sit on the end of the handle is about like that, which means that this bolt needs to be coming straight down through to hit about right there. And right now, the bottom part goes in at the right angle, but the top adjusts to a slightly different angle that totally messes everything up. So, I'm going to rebore the end of this using a 1/2 inch end mill, forge out a little bit more bronze, run back to Alec's shop, turn up the pommel nut with a wider diameter for the secondary step up there, and then keep on moving forward. Well, now that we figured out that we have a nice fun problem to solve, we're gonna have to call it there for today's episode. Don't worry, you gotta stick around for part 2. Don't forget to like and comment and subscribe, maybe even put on post notifications if you wanna get notified when the next video goes live. But thank you so much to Athletic Greens for sponsoring today's episode, and thank you guys for watching. With that, I'll see you on the next one. Bye.